This is Meredith, or Mary for short if you prefer, and basically all I wrote in the script at this point was grab Mary and see if she had anything to say, because she's a cat, and the protagonist of the game I'm talking about is a cat, and, well, Mary, was this worth the hassle, or do you just want to leave? Okay. Well, a firm ho-ho-muck hello to you, you lovely people. I am Tessellating Hexagons, and I shan't beat about the bush here. Usually, I like to produce 2 of these video essay things per month, one about Eurovision and one about gaming, and I recorded this in March. You know, the month where I literally worked so hard on Eurovision reviews that at one point I was kept awake until 4 AM vomiting my guts out. True story. Well, why am I telling you this? Because I'm taking a quick break from Eurovision videos and just focusing on doing one video about a game that I just recently finished Let's Playing, meaning that I have an entire playthrough's worth of footage already to hand on my hard drive. Basically, it's easy and it's accessible and I'm stressed out and stuff. And also, I mean, if the game is good enough for a Tessex Let's Play, then it's good enough for a Tessex video essay, or Tessay for short. See what I did there? Now, before I stray even further from the topic at hand, the game in question is one Night in the Woods, the brainchild of Alec Holovka, Scott Benson, and Bethany Hockenberry, working under the banner of Infinite Fall, or just IF for short, with some input by Secret Lab and 22nd Century Toys, though quite how much input I admit I'm not entirely sure. The game is a story-heavy, choices matter-ish, almost, kind of, visual novel, side-scrolling platformer. It's somewhere in that bubble. In a way, it's like a very small Metroidvania with a heavy emphasis on story and realism, sharing in Steven Universe creator Rebecca Sugar's philosophy of reverse escapism. That is, fantastic characters dealing with real-world problems rather than the inverse. And while a dying Rust Belt town full of anthropomorphic animals isn't quite as fantasy as a race of sentient shape-shifting alien gemstones, I would say it still fits that description rather nicely. Basically, what I mean is, it's a platformer in that that's the medium it uses to convey its story, but it's not trying to be the next Mario or Sonic. The game was published by Finji on the PC and PS4, with later releases also emerging on the Xbox One and the Nintendo Switch, and possibly some mobile devices, but I'm less sure of that specific side of things. What I do know for certain, though, is that the original release date was the 21st of February 2017, which was just for the PC and PS4 versions, and just in North America, because you are an online indie game, why are you doing the release date thing? But whatever. The game released in Europe a week later on those same platforms on the 28th, and, well, the Xbox One version did release worldwide, but it had to wait until the 13th of December that year, and third verse same as the first 2 with Nintendo Switch, which followed suit on the 1st of February 2018. As far as I'm aware, all subsequent re-releases of the game fall under the umbrella of the Weird Autumn edition of the game, which was patched onto the original PC and PS4 versions to provide additional content and dialogue, and to include, in the base game, 2 bonus gameling demo-y kind of things that provide a bit more story and context to the world in which Night in the Woods takes place, one of which being produced before the game originally was, like it was the original demo or proof of concept or something. Again, I'm not super certain of the specifics, but chances are, if you buy the game right this second, you are probably getting the Weird Autumn release, and that's the much more canonically complete version of the game, and that can only be a good thing. Right, so I feel like we're only a few minutes into this video, and I've already been consistently losing focus at a rate of knots, so let's recap what we know about this game. As I said, it's a side-scroller with obvious platforming elements, but the focus of the game is on the characters and their story, and the goings-on in the town of Possum Springs in the fictitious Deep Hollow County of Pennsylvania. Well, it's never outright stated to be Pennsylvania, to be honest. In fact, judging by the local topography and political and economic climates, it could be any one of Pennsylvania, New York State, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, or Wisconsin, the fundamental common thread being that these are the so-called Rust Belt states. That is, states whose economy historically relied on heavy industry, mining, steel production, and so on, and so were very heavily affected by a decline in work and population around the middle of the 20th century, with little hope for revival or redemption, leading to widespread disillusionment, political unrest, and general despair amongst the local population, both the older generations for the loss of their former livelihoods, and the younger generations for a lack of opportunities or career paths. As a result, it's no surprise that these often end up being the swing states in major elections. Now, I've gone to such great pains to describe the circumstances of the region here because it is a crucial building block of the game's world and the story it wants to tell. The story that Night in the Woods presents could really only be told in a place that's undergone exactly that kind of stagnated development. Take that away, and the story suddenly loses meaning and rationale and impact in a lot of ways. And it kind of has to be America's version of that as well, because there are some themes and ideas and things, mentalities within the characters that just wouldn't work if this played out in, for instance, the north of England, which underwent very similar things post-industrial revolution. Key themes within the story are coming to terms with the cards life deals you, dealing with adversity, and a clash of ideals separated by the generation gap. And these are all variables that would lead to a very different narrative if they were to play out elsewhere in the US, or, in fact, as I said, elsewhere in the world at large. And it's not just the story that's affected by those variables either. The characters are shaped by them too, and the characters, in turn, also feed back into the overall story and how it develops and what happens and all that good stuff. So I do think it's worth our while to take a moment and go over who the lead players are in the game's plot here. First up, we have our protagonist, a black cat by the name of Margaret May Borowski. After 2 years of living away, she drops out of university following a mental breakdown and returns to her family home in Possum Springs, and the whole story of the game revolves around her readjusting to small-town life, seeing what's changed, what hasn't, and how she's supposed to fit in with all of it. And considering that she's had numerous mental health difficulties in the past, including one dissociative episode in which she bludgeoned a fellow student with a softball bat, both she and her parents are concerned about where her life is heading in the immediate future. To keep her in check, though, we are very quickly introduced to her Vulpine best friend of many years, Gregory Lee, or Greg for short. He's rather hyperactive and something of a free spirit, to put it gently, being, as he is, so fond of crimes, just as a pastime. His boyfriend, meanwhile, a bear named Angus Delaney, is quite the opposite. Reticent, sensible, and far more book-smart. If you happen to see my video about Oxenfree, he's very much the Nona of the cast. Not in terms of airheadedness, but simply because he's the most friend of a friend of the core group, and thus the one May spends the least time with overall, for reasons I'll touch upon later on. And finally, of the central team, we have Beatrice Santello, or just B. She works in a local hardware store owned by her widowed father, and despite being a few months younger than May, she's decades more mature. Consequently, she comes across as calloused and distant, and if you don't spend much time with her, you might not be inclined to like her that much. That's paralleled in her friendship with May too, in that they'd very much grown apart even before May had left for university, and the road to repairing that friendship, should you choose to walk it, is far from straightforward or smooth. So, as you can probably infer, the main element of the gameplay experience revolves around the storytelling being remediated through May's relationships with her friends, and, on a less momentous scale, the town of Possum Springs at large. For instance, if you spend enough time talking to the right people, you can see entirely optional bonus scenes where May hangs out with a horror film enthusiast down by the train tracks, or an eccentric half-friend who's implied to have Asperger's, I think it is. It's not entirely clear, and the more I play the game, the less sure I am about that. But beyond that, May's also able to just poke around the town and, for instance, find a nest of rats that she can spend several days raising, or catch up with an old family friend who tells her about her late grandfather and her family history, or get to know a homeless chap who's down on his luck, camping out by the church. And the best part is, you can do all of these optional things in the same playthrough of the game. They're not mutually exclusive, they don't, overwrite each other. So you can get as much character development and story development and world building as you want to go out and look for. The world is designed to immerse the player as much as the player wants to be immersed. But these are just small potatoes compared to the game's main draw. the actual central main story.
The game is really rather clever in how it handles its storytelling, all things considered. It has two very potent methods at its disposal to tell a compelling story, and it interweaves the two seamlessly. First of all, the story the game advertises and the story the game tells are two very different entities without necessarily contradicting your expectations, and that's something I'll touch upon more in a moment. And secondly, it strikes a very careful balance between telling a narrative that relies on the player investing in its characters on emotional and social levels, and keeping the player in the dark with regards to certain aspects of those same characters until the time is most apt to divulge more. That is to say, when the game begins, we're introduced to May through a very brief diary entry thing, before being dropped straight into the action, as it were, where we learn about what sort of person she is. Snarky, just athletic enough to get by, and yet notably fragile on the inside. But that's the beauty of it. We don't get a lengthy backstory that tells us every last detail of her history, and we're not privy to anything that isn't apparent at first glance. This is our first impression of our protagonist, and the game knows that. From there, it then seeds in these little implications that there's more to her past than we know about, and that we really should know about it, but that it carries enough weight that that knowledge has to be earned over time, rather than just handed out freely from the outset.
So, in a somewhat roundabout way, we're reminded that we aren't inside the protagonist's head. Rather, we are as much one of the cast as Greg and Bea and Angus, insofar as May trusts us enough to be sympathetic to her point of view, but we only know what she chooses to show or to tell us, and that makes for a very engrossing, very effective means of sucking us into the world without having to thrust pages and pages of exposition in our general direction in the process. Consequently, everything that we know about May, we feel like we have worked to find out, so to speak, or that we've been entrusted with that knowledge rather than just being given it. And so it means all the more to us that we know what we do about her. She feels like a friend. And from that foundation, the story focuses so heavily on her and her experiences and her perspective of everything. And because we hold our understanding of her as a character so dearly, so closely, it all has that much more of an impact. Because in learning about her from the point of view of a new friend, she feels, to us, like a friend, and not just pixels on a screen. She's someone very real to us as the audience, as players. And that very concept actually relates back to an important theme that comes up in the later reaches of the story, but all good things in due time.
For now, let's circle back around to the story itself, since I've managed to go for about half of this video now praising it without actually explaining what it involves. So, at first glance, it's just what it says on the tin. May returning home from a disastrous tenure at university, trying to fit back into her old routine whilst coming to terms with what has or hasn't changed in her hometown, be it new shops opening and old ones closing, or friends and family members growing up, getting jobs, or otherwise changing, or even the much more heavy-hitting idea that parts of May herself have or haven't changed, and whether or not the way people respond to that has changed, like things that she could get away with as a young tyke suddenly being beyond reproach now that she's 20 and, ostensibly, a responsible adult. And at first, that is what the story is. For a few in-game days, we follow May around, exploring the town as it gradually opens up to us, with certain areas conveniently blocked while roadworks and other street-level repairs continue in the wake of a particularly vicious storm prior to May's return at the start of the game. Whether you choose to engage with the optional content in the town or not is up to the player, but you can't avoid the main story beats, which involve catching up with May's friends directly. On some days, you're explicitly given a choice as to whether to spend time with Bea or with Greg. And, in fact, 3 such points occur within this act of the story, and whoever you spend more time with now dictates whose friendship route you ultimately bring to fruition later on. And on other days, you just have to talk to the right person in the right place, and then go to band practice for a Guitar Hero-esque rhythm minigame in which May plays the bass of a song, performed by a band consisting of her and her 3 closest friends. And on some days, you get to do both in close succession.
But bear in mind what I was saying before, that one of the game's greatest assets is that the story you think you're going to get, and the story you're actually given, are two very different presences after a point. So the story begins in this relatively tame way, even going so far as to, as I've done with this synopsis, completely gloss over the fact that the group happens upon a dismembered arm just casually lying in the street on May's first day back in town. All that does is alert the player that maybe something else might be afoot, or an arm, as the case may be, but it's not until the second major act of the story that this properly kicks off, and the fact that the game doesn't even bother to address it in much more than a cursory, almost blasé kind of way, should tip you off that this is something to be keeping an eye on in the background until it makes itself known again.
See, as it is, May has already shown signs of uneasiness with her own mental state, and, no pun intended, this all comes to a head during the Halloween festival of Harfest, during which she's the sole witness to a kidnapping perpetrated by a ghostly figure that, or so she thinks, has been harassing her remotely, stalking her in the real world, and from then on in her dreams. Seeing this kidnapping happen, being powerless to prevent it, and to have her reports thrown back in her face, since no one has actually reported anyone missing in the wake of the event, only served to result in her having a full-on meltdown. Or she would, were it not for her friends being there to help her.
As a show of solidarity and friendship, Greg, Bea, and Angus do pitch in to help May investigate this ghost of hers, more out of skepticism and a desire to see her return to relative health than because they believe her necessarily, but every little helps. Tesco, it's something, I don't know what I'm trying to say. They're helping, never mind the reason why. And so the second act of the game becomes this ghost hunty, paranormal activity-y, conspiracy theory-y hunt for answers, and, once again, there are 3 in-game days where May can spend time with her friends. This time, though, each one of Bea, Greg, and Angus all have 1 event each. But you can only commit to 2 of them in a single playthrough despite having 3 in-game days, because the second of those 3 in-game days is taken up by forcing the player into an extra event unrelated to the ghost hunt, unrelated to the overall story arc, with either Bea or Greg and Angus together, depending on who May spent more time with in the first act of this particular playthrough. And again, it serves to deepen our understanding of them as characters. It enrichens the world, if that's a word, without advancing the plot.
Now, to say much more about what comes of this ghost hunt would broach major spoiler territory, and I highly advise playing the game for yourself to fully appreciate why I'm praising it here. Just know that it does an excellent job of tying together all of the themes presented thus far in the game, including the aforementioned war of ideologies between the older and younger generations with respect to the future of the Rust Belt states, the notion of coming of age when you're already physically of age, so to speak, themes of identity, dissociation, and mental health, and about the power of friendship in general, not in a sappy Saturday morning cartoonish kind of way, but in a much more heavy-hitting, real-world kind of way, showing the practical benefits of cultivating and maintaining a social circle, and how having anything from a shoulder to cry on to full-on moral support in your hour of need can literally be the difference between survival and a total and unreversible breakdown. Oh yeah, this game deals with heavy stuff, and it deals with it so amazingly well.
As it is, depending on how much you're willing to invest in the optional side stuff, even things as minor as talking to characters more than once on the same in-game day, or, talking to May's parents if you run into them multiple times, and not just when the game forces you into a cutscene with them, but choosing to talk to them subsequent times even after you've been told, okay, the reins are off, you can go and wander around town. If you choose to hang out and talk to them some more, or even just exploring the town without actually interacting with anything, just to see if May makes a note of it in her journal. All of this, you can expect the game to broach subjects like religion, class mobility, mental health, gender identity, sexuality without anything inappropriate, because not all furry stuff is porn, goddammit, and even domestic abuse in more than one case. To reiterate, the game is not afraid to go all in on its subject matter, and I salute it for doing so, not for shock value, mind you, but because it knows what it's talking about and uses those themes to great effect and never once gives the impression of just trying to capitalize on or otherwise trivialize serious issues. And the crowning achievement of it all is the fact that it uses a platforming engine with a dangerously simple, endearing art style to get all of this across in a convincingly written, present-day setting with plausible characters who we get to know in a manner so organic that you are strongly, and yet only ever implicitly, encouraged to forget that they are, when all is said and done, just shapes.
In any case though, I feel like some of this video was, perhaps, more directionless, praiseful rambling than detailed analysis, but the bottom line is, this game resonates with me in a number of ways. Yes, it being a furry work helps, especially since the creators have gone on record to say that the cast are, in fact, anthropomorphic animals, and that it's not meant to be a visual metaphor or anything like that, but really, it's one of those hauntingly believable stories with characters whose lives and problems are just too real. It's the sort of thing that mainstream media is still afraid to tackle in 2019 in a lot of cases, and yet this game swoops in and covers it all so elegantly. I won't say that the game gives voice to the voiceless necessarily, but I'd like to think that to anyone suffering from depression or anxiety or any of the other mental health issues addressed or embodied by the game or its characters, or to anyone feeling a sense of disenfranchisement from or that they lack a place in the world, this game is a wholeheartedly validating experience. Your problems are real. Other people have to deal with them too, and not everyone comes out the other side of them as a winner. So if you feel like you're falling behind, you're not. It's completely normal. There's no shame in feeling hurt when life tries to hurt you.
So, when it comes to giving this game a grade, I can only award it a rank A, and that's not me being some kind of ultra-politically correct 21st century millennial whatever. I'm not just giving it the highest grade on my scale just because it tackles sensitive issues at all, never mind the fact that it tackles them well, for that matter. Rather, I want to acknowledge that this game takes those concepts and themes, and a bunch of other stuff, and presents them fairly and well, all whilst still being an engaging, well-written, well-soundtracked, well-produced overall piece. Yes, if you're not in the best of states going into this game, it can be a very depressing experience from the outset, just on a surface level. But if you're prepared to see the game through to the end and see what comes of May's ghost hunt and her relationships and whatnot, even if aspects of it end up being a bust and things just go back to normal with no particular winners, so to speak, well, I'm sure you can see the metaphor I'm sloppily building up to here. Stick it out to the end. If things get better, they get better. If they don't, at least it's over. Life, as they say, goes on. And on that weirdly existential note, I think I should sign things off, starting, as ever, with my usual grateful acknowledgement of the kind folks on patreon.com/TessHex who powered this video. As I remind y'all every single time, just signing up to that at all nets you the ability to watch these videos a month before they go public here on YouTube, with no ads on top of that. And if you feel like pledging more, I am fully prepared to reward your generosity accordingly. There's more information in the video description, in the video iCard. Check it out, you know how YouTube works at this point. But as you can see, these videos do get to YouTube eventually, albeit with ads, so there's no pressure, but I'd appreciate it if you'd at least give it a consider. You know, give it a consider. In any case, though, as always, I have been, and will continue to be, tessellating Hexagons, and I do hope you can join me for whichever video endeavor you'd care to join me for next. Until then,